My journey started 20 years ago in 1995 when I was 22 years old. I'd left the American white power skinhead movement that I'd helped build. I was 22 years old, and I had spent 7 years being taught how to hate and teaching hate to other people as part of an extremist hate group here in America. But before that, at 14 years old, I was a pretty normal kid. At 14 years old when I was recruited, I was a normal kid from the south side of Chicago. I grew up in an Italian neighborhood. I came from a loving family. And, while my parents were Italian immigrants who came here in the mid-1960s looking for their slice of the American pie, they worked hard. They were really content that I was being raised by grandparents and my aunts and uncles while they were working hard at work. But I really missed my parents. So I grew up as a lonely kid in an Italian neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. All that changed when I was 14 years old, and I met somebody who changed my life forever. I was standing in an alley at 14, smoking a joint by myself, and like a scene out of a movie, a 1969 Firebird came roaring down the alley. It was spitting up gravel and dust, and it stopped 6 inches from me. Out of that car, out of the passenger side, came a guy with a shaved head, tall boots, and suspenders, and he crossed a beam of headlights from that car, and he stopped 6 inches from me, and he pointed at my joint, and he said, "Don't you know that that's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile?" Now, I was 14 years old. I didn't know what a communist was. I'd probably never met a Jewish person before, hardly knew how to spell the word docile. But I was struck immediately by the confidence that this person had. He was paying attention to me like nobody else was paying attention to me. He told me to stop doing something because he thought it was bad for me, not just because he was an adult saying, "Don't do that and you're not supposed to do that." I felt like he cared for me. And here I was, this lonely, marginalized kid who'd grown up in a lower middle class neighborhood, was rapidly changing, and this person paid attention to me. Now, after I met this person, I realized who he was. I asked around the neighborhood. His name was Clark Martell, and he was the first American neo-Nazi skinhead gang leader. He started his group right across the alley from where I grew up. So a couple weeks later, as I was contemplating this meeting, I was riding my bike back from a Little League game, and I got stopped by 5 black guys who beat me up and stole my bike. And suddenly everything fell into place. What he told me was the blacks were moving into my neighborhood, and they were raping our women. They were bringing violent crime. The Mexicans were moving into our neighborhood, and they were bringing gangs and drugs. Jewish people wanted to wipe out my race. They were promoting white genocide. Even at 14 years old, this started to make sense to me. So I went back and I asked to join this group. And I started to recruit people the same way I had been recruited, through fear and through ignorance. But I thought that I was doing something noble. I thought that I was protecting my family. I was proud of my heritage, so I thought, yeah, you're right. These people are moving into my neighborhood. And I started to see through a twisted lens that this individual who had recruited me at 14 years old was right. Shortly after that, Clark and several of the original founding members of the skinhead group had gone to prison for a string of violent hate crimes across Chicago. It was the 49th anniversary of Kristallnacht, which was the Jewish anniversary. It was the German anniversary when the Nazis went into the Jewish shops and broke all the shops. They did the same thing here in Chicago. So they had gone to prison, and suddenly at 16 years old, I had been recruiting people, and suddenly there was this void left over of leadership. So I stepped into the leadership role at 16 years old, and I started to recruit people the same way that I had been recruited, by telling them that there were people attacking their race from every side. Now, time went on, and I started to become a very respected leader, both locally and regionally, and then it grew to nationally and internationally. I'd started a band that was singing white power music, racist music that was used to recruit people. It was a powerful propaganda tool for young people to adhere to. So after years of doing this, I'd been recruiting people, and now I was in a position of power. Until one day, I fell in love with a girl. And at 18 years old, I got married, and I had my first child at 19. And what I had been teaching, when I held my son in my hands for the first time, and I connected with the innocence that I remembered before I was 14 and before I was recruited, suddenly overtook me. The love that had entered my heart from my child suddenly started to push the hate out. But then my wires got crossed. I started to think, I have this son to protect now. I have this family that I'm responsible for. And I went back into the movement. Rather than facing the logic and being rational about being confused about this ideology that started to not make sense to me anymore, I twisted it and I went back. I retreated back into this movement that I'd become a part of. At 19 years old, I opened a record shop with the primary intent of selling white power music. This was before the internet, so it was a very high-touch business at that point. I was importing it from Europe, and I was one of the only stores in America that was selling this white power music. People were driving in from all over the country to buy music from bands like Screwdriver and Brutal Attack and No Remorse, bands from Europe who were singing this white power music. But another thing happened to me at that time. Because I wanted to be a good entrepreneur like my parents were, I vowed to myself that I was going to bite my tongue, I was going to sell other music in the store, so I started selling punk rock and ska and heavy metal and rockabilly and hip hop. And before I knew it, I started to meet people who I'd alienated from my circle for 7 years, and I started to bond with them through music. I started to meet black people and have dialogues with them for the first time in my life. I started to meet Jewish people. I started to meet same-sex couples. And quickly I realized that I had the same pain that they felt when they lost somebody in their lives. I had the same love in my heart that they had when they held their children in their arms. And I started to bond with them on a human level. I started to humanize them for the first time in 7 years. Now, the white power music that I was selling was a big hit. Eventually it became 75% of my record sales. When I started to meet these people and I started to bond with them rather than the family that I had built around me for 7 years, I started to feel really embarrassed about what I was doing. So I pulled the white power music from the shelf. Of course, my sales tanked, had to close the store down, but I never forgot the relationships that I built with these people. When my store closed, I lost everything. I had given up on my ideology. I'd lost my business and my source of income. I'd alienated my parents from my life. My wife and my children left me because they weren't a part of my movement, and I hadn't left yet. And the social circle that I'd built around me suddenly disintegrated. So for 5 years, I went through a major depression. I had left my ideology behind, but I was trying to outrun it. I didn't talk about it. I tried to make new friends. I tried to move on, but I hadn't healed because I hadn't talked about what I'd been through. Until 1999, when I took a chance on a temp job with IBM. I got the job, and of the millions of places that IBM could have placed me, they put me at my old high school that I'd gotten kicked out of twice for a computer rollout program. As you can imagine, I was terrified. Here I've got this new job, I've got this new life, I thought I'd outrun my past. So I thought, I'm going to show up the first day, somebody's going to point me out, they're going to say, there's that ex-neo-Nazi, or there's that neo-Nazi guy, let's get him out of here. Turns out the first day I was there, I actually bumped into the old black security guard that I'd gotten in a fist fight with about 9 years before. I didn't know what to do. So I knew at that moment that I had to do something different. So I chased after him, and I tapped him on the shoulder, and he turned around, and his smile turned into a scowl, because immediately he remembered who I was. And I said to him, I didn't know what else to say, I said, I'm sorry. I said, I'm sorry for putting you through what I did. I'm a different person. I'm not that person anymore. And we talked for a while, and we hugged, and we shook hands, and we both cried. And he made me promise that I would tell my story. I would tell you that compassion from the people that I least deserved it from is what changed my life. The empathy that I started to feel when I started to humanize people that I had alienated from my circle for 7 years came back to me. It came back to me just like when I was a child, and it forced me to humanize people again. I've planted a lot of seeds of hate for those 7 years that I was involved, and now it's my mission to pull those weeds out and to teach people that compassion and empathy is what can change this world. Everybody here can go out into the world and change it with empathy and compassion and give it to the people who least deserve it, because that's what broke me down and that's what's helped me. And now I have an organization called Life After Hate where I actually educate people on racism and compassion, and we pull people out of hate groups. And it's my mission. I promised him many, many years ago that I would continue to talk about my story, and that's why I'm here today. Thank you very much.